This is Frank. He lives in North Carolina. It's starting to snow, and Frank is happy because it never snows in North Carolina. Maybe now we'll be able to build a snowman. But the clouds are covering the sun, and the snow is accumulating. Frank is getting cold. He doesn't own any winter clothing. How will Frank cope? The hairs on Frank's arms are standing up. What is going on underneath? Sensory neurons have two myelinated axons instead of one axon and a dendrite. The sensory neurons in Frank's arms have axons that extend into the layers of his skin. Myelin is formed from Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. It allows signals to propagate along the axon at a much faster rate, much like the coating on a copper wire. Schwann cells are lined up along the axon, encasing it. The sodium-potassium pump is a method of active transport that moves potassium ions to the inside of the cell and sodium ions to the outside of the cell in order to maintain a consistent negative membrane potential. Stimulation from the snow causes ion channels in the plasma membrane of the axon to open up. Positive sodium ions flow down the electrochemical gradient because the inside of the cell is slightly negative and has a low concentration of sodium ions to begin with. The increase in sodium inside of the cell causes depolarization, which means that the membrane potential becomes slightly less negative. This slight depolarization triggers more sodium ion channels to open, which makes the membrane potential even more positive. The signal traveling through Frank's neuron is electrical, and electrical signals can jump the sections of myelin. The initial depolarization travels down the first axon to the cell body by stimulating the opening of more sodium ion channels. Eventually, it acts as the initial stimulation for the plasma membrane of the cell body. Voltage-gated sodium ion channels open and depolarize the membrane. The influx of sodium ions causes a higher level of depolarization. Following depolarization in the membrane of the axon, a delayed response is occurring to offset the depolarization. Positive potassium ions flow out of the cell at this location in order to repolarize the cell, or bring it back to its initial membrane potential of approximately -70 millivolts. Because the potassium ion channels are slightly delayed, the cell membrane will become slightly too negative before it settles back out at its resting potential. This time is called the refractory period, and prevents the electrical signal from propagating the wrong direction. The depolarization of the cell at the cell body plasma membrane jumps to the beginning of the second axon and causes an initial depolarization. When the plasma membrane is depolarized to a certain extent, known as the threshold potential, more voltage-gated sodium ion channels open in the plasma membrane of the axon. An increased amount of sodium ions flow down the electrochemical gradient into the cell. In the axon, this depolarization is called an action potential. Back at the plasma membrane of the cell, the same repolarization is occurring as occurred in the first axon. Potassium ions flow out of the cell in a delayed response, and membrane potential is restored. To move a signal down an axon, many action potentials must occur. To allow this, there are small spaces in between sections of myelin called nodes of Ranvier. The depolarization of the membrane at the start of the axon jumps to the first node, where they initiate a threshold potential. Voltage-gated ion channels open, and more sodium ions flow across the membrane to form another action potential. At the first location on the axon, the delayed response to repolarize the membrane occurs, and potassium ions leave the cell across the membrane. The signal that was initiated by a feeling of cold propagates itself up the axon of the sensory neuron towards the spinal cord. The refractory period prevents a particular portion of the neuron from propagating a message backwards. Upon reaching the spinal cord, the end of the axon synapses with neurons in the spinal cord. The end of the axon is called the axon terminal. There is a space in between the axon terminal and the dendrites of the receiving cell. The electrical signal from the last action potential jumps the last bit of myelin to reach the terminal. There, sodium ion channels open, and sodium ions depolarize the membrane. In the synapse, the signal changes from electrical to chemical. This final membrane depolarization triggers voltage-gated calcium ion channels to open. Calcium flows into the cell, triggering the fusion of a vesicle containing neurotransmitters and the membrane of the axon terminal. The neurotransmitters are released into the synapse. In the synapse, the neurotransmitters bind to receptors on the receiving cell that are specifically shaped to recognize only those neurotransmitters. The delayed potassium response occurs in the presynaptic axon terminal, and the plasma membrane is repolarized. The binding of neurotransmitters causes a conformational change in the receptor proteins in the membrane of the postsynaptic cell. This conformational change allows the receptor proteins to act as sodium ion channels, and sodium ions flow into the cell, depolarizing the membrane. The signal then becomes electrical again and propagates itself up the neuron in the spinal cord using action potentials. The neurotransmitters in the synapse have completed their job. One of two things may happen to them. First, they could be taken back up into the presynaptic cell by neurotransmitter transport proteins and repackaged into vesicles. This way, the neuron may use the same neurotransmitters over and over again. The second option is that the neurotransmitters will be broken down in the synapse. This forces the cell to produce new neurotransmitters. The electrical signal in the spinal cord neurons will be propagated up to Frank's brain to tell it that his body temperature is dropping. After his brain registers the signal from the sensory neuron in his arm, it sends a message back out through the spinal cord to a motor neuron. Motor neurons are responsible for movement of muscles. Frank begins to shiver because this is one of the body's responses to a drop in temperature. He knows this will help, but no one likes to shiver.